Hey His Hands family, I'm Maya and I'm going to be continuing my discussion with Ben on the Holy Spirit. Okay Ben, is praying in tongues the Holy Spirit? Because that's another one of those, I don't want just terms that are kind of, if you're in church then you hear that a lot. So how does that relate? Since we just talked about prayer last time, now we're talking about the Holy Spirit. I feel like that's a good like overarching bridge of.
Yeah, well, really can of worms there.
Yeah.
So is it, you're asking, is it the Holy Spirit or is that?
Yeah, well, I guess not necessarily is it, just I guess touch on what it is or what it means. Yeah. Is really what I'm trying to get for the heart of it.
Well, maybe we should start with like just a kind of a review, like an anatomy lesson of a regenerated person. Okay. So there's lots of different terms, because a lot of times the way, like in the church, we define certain things about ourselves, categories, is different than like the world talks about it. Mm-hmm. So like we have body, soul, spirit, like these kind of categories. So everybody has a body, you know, when you have senses and 5 senses and all that. And we have a soul, and by the soul, I mean like mind, will, emotions. So without a regenerated spirit, we kind of live right there. Body, soul, or like, you know, mind, will, emotions, and then our body. And so on the outward part, it's our body. But then on the inside, we've got our mind, but our mind, will, and emotions controls our body. But you don't really root down any deeper than that without a regenerated spirit. And you might have a conscience, but the conscience, you know, without Jesus just condemns you. Right. And so in salvation, it is that spirit is made new in us. It's made alive. So that heart of stone becomes a heart of flesh. A new spirit is put in us, and so that spirit becomes alive. And it's the spirit that now gets mingled together with God's spirit. So that's like in Romans 8, Paul describes his spirit testifies with our spirit that we are the children of God. So like that's the two spirits together forever is what becomes impossible to describe. So that's the reality for believers. Like when we become saved, that's the way our spirits are. It's like Zacchaeus and Jesus at home in their house. The continual forever redecoration process. Right. Zacchaeus on mission in Jericho. And so it's from that. So then the Spirit is in charge of everything else. So the Spirit is in charge of our soul, our mind, will, and emotions. And that's the new thing, because we're not maybe used to that. You know, we're still like, we kind of live in our minds, or I've made decisions, I'm going to do this. I'm feeling cranky today, whatever. But our spirit, like if we really engage that, the Spirit says no. Right. And like everything else comes in line, and then our body follows our soul. So speaking in tongues, sorry. I was doing that, illustrating speaking in tongues. So speaking in tongues it's like people think of it as being strange, but the strange part is not like the words that come out that you don't quite understand, because that's like trying to understand speaking in tongues divorced from the spiritual part of it. Like, explain to me in mental terms what's going on when you're saying words that you don't understand. Right. Like, of course I don't understand them because they're spiritual. Right. Like, whenever we take what is spiritual and we try to say, I'm only gonna engage with that if I can completely understand it and explain it and wrap my arms around it, then we're not there yet. We're not really being spiritual. The way Paul describes it, because this is the faith thing. Like, we're saved by grace through faith. And faith is what we don't know. Like Hebrews says, faith is the assurance of what is unseen. So you take the best that you can do, your mind, will, and emotions, here, and then faith is where you say, but then again, Jesus lives in me, in my spirit, and so there's freedom now to go into all the rest of this that I don't understand. You know, it's like you're strapped into the car seat with your dad, and you don't know where your dad's going.
Right.
You know, he's driving. I just know it's going to be good.
Yeah.
So the speaking in tongues is like your spirit's in charge, and then your body's engaged, like speaking some things that your mind doesn't quite understand in the middle. But it's an illustration of that would be like in Romans 8, Paul describes, I think I made a note of this one. So in the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So that's like not specifically like speaking in tongues necessarily. I mean, some people put that in the same kind of category, but already that's strange enough. Like sometimes, or oftentimes, we so much don't understand the situation. Like, how do I solve that situation at work with that person? Or in my family, I don't know how to move ahead in this particular relationship, but the Holy Spirit does. And so the Holy Spirit is already there praying for us with groans that we don't understand. So if that's the normal reality, that the Holy Spirit understands so much more than we do, and is already praying ahead of us, then it's not so, like that's the weird part.
Yeah.
Like that's us living at the tree of life rather than the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil means I have to understand everything perfectly.
Right.
That's the only area that I trust. But now my trust is in the Spirit of life. And so sometimes, like that's just the Spirit connects to the body, the mind doesn't understand in the middle. Yeah.
That was fantastic. It was, like, it was a really good explanation, because I've heard, different opinions and different, I guess, takes on it. But that was a very good read of just like a physical analogy of what's going on and the willingness to understand that it's not something that I'm going to fully understand in the moment. Yeah.
And there's debate about it, like, does everybody have this gift, or everybody can have this gift? Because Paul seems to say, like in 1 Corinthians 12, it seems like everybody doesn't. But then in 1 Corinthians 14, he's sort of describing, like, if you want other gifts, just ask for other gifts. And so, but either way, like, everyone, I think, should be praying in the Spirit. Like, that's what prayer is. Like, everything that you discussed, like with Irene, all of this is, we're only able to pray because of the Spirit. And the Spirit is, by definition, leading us into all the stuff that we don't understand and goes beyond our mind. I think I even wrote down references to a couple of these verses that describe this about the Spirit. This is 1 Corinthians 2. Yeah, I love this one. This is on my wall in my office. This is so, I have to have this. This is the Message version. It says, the unspiritual self, just as it is by nature, can't receive the gifts of God's Spirit. There's no capacity for them. They seem like it's so much silliness. Spirit can only be known by Spirit. God's Spirit and our spirits in open communion. Spiritually alive, we have access to everything that God's Spirit is doing and can't be judged by unspiritual critics. Isaiah's question, is there anyone around who knows God's Spirit? Anyone who knows what he's doing? That has been answered. Christ knows, and we have Christ's Spirit. So, if we want to have a relationship with God, and that's what we've signed up for, then like everything has to get torn down. So it's not like, I have a list of questions, Jesus, and I'm going to have a quiet time, and I'm hoping you're going to answer a few of these today.
Yeah.
Maybe it goes like that, but probably not, because everything gets redecorated. It's probably like, you got this list of questions, and Jesus is going to spend the first part of it saying, you got the wrong questions. Instead, these are the better questions. And the Holy Spirit is going to say, this is what's really broken, and this is the way we go. There's a fly that keeps coming around.
Hovering,
Yeah. So it's like, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We don't know what we should be praying for, but the Spirit teaches us to pray. So every time when we try to describe our spirituality in terms of like, describe what's me and describe what's God. God says, that's not really my intent, because I want us living together. Like
Right.
my home is with you. And so it needs to be a little difficult for us to describe, was that me or was that him?
Right.
Like you'll know it's Jesus if it's in the Holy Spirit, if it's loving. Because this is, God is love. Like we're told that like a lot in the Gospels of John and in 1 John. That's who God is.